All right, you've been patient enough. It's time for us to actually write some JavaScript and run it in Node. And as we move forward in this course, and we're going to write plenty more code, I think you'll appreciate the importance of having that foundational proper mental model of how things really work. And that will allow us to expand on our knowledge in a much more complete way. But for starters, we need to actually get started using Node.js. To begin with, we need to install Node.js. If you've already done that before this course began, great. If not, you need to go to nodejs.org. This is also where you'll go to find the Node.js documentation. Here on this homepage, we find, for example, that sample web server that we originally talked about at the beginning of this course, and we'll be able to understand that soon enough. There's a big install button, and the website will try to figure out which install you most likely need. So you can click on install to download that, or you can go to downloads, where you'll see that there are Windows and Macintosh installers, as well as installers for Linux and Sun OS, and the source code itself that we saw before. But we don't want the source code. We just want to install Node and have it running on our computer. So if you haven't installed Node.js yet, you can go ahead and pause this video, go do that now, and then come back. You'll need Node.js for the rest of this course. All right, so we have Node.js installed. On Windows, it actually installs an executable file. That is, all that source code that we saw before is actually compiled into a single file that runs on my computer. It also installs something called npm. That's very important, and we'll talk about that quite a bit later in the course. The most important thing is that you have Node installed properly, which means you should have access to it, be able to use it inside your command line interface for the operating system you're running. I'm running Windows, and so I've opened the node.js command prompt, which helps me make sure that Node is available in the command line. But you might be using Linux or Mac, you might be running Bash or Terminal or another command line interface, and if Node is installed properly, you should be able to type the command node-v. Node being the program node, and -v being an argument, simply saying, what version of Node am I running? And I'll hit enter. And there you see the version of Node that I'm running currently. Now you may have a lesser version or a later version, but the idea is that you can run this command and not receive any errors. That means that Node is installed and you can use it properly. The idea being that you can run the Node command no matter what folder or file you're looking at in the command line interface, that Node has just become a command that you can use. For example, in Windows you might have added Node to your path variable, which means it's available everywhere in the regular command line. Or in Mac or Linux, there's other options. But whatever the case, there's plenty out there on the internet to help you if you have an error, if you have an installation problem on whatever OS you're using. But you need to be at this point before you can move on with the course. You need to be able to type Node and just put -v, hit enter, and you should get the version. If you have that, then you're ready to move on with the rest of the course. All right, well, it's time. At last, we're going to write some JavaScript in Node. All you have to do is type the word Node in your computer, in your command line interface, and again, if this errored, you can look on the internet for help, or you may need to reboot your computer for this to kick, for the command to be recognized in the command line, but you should be able to hit Node and just hit enter. That will start a command line interface program that comes along for the ride with Node, where I can simply type JavaScript into the command line and get the output back after it's been processed through the V8 engine in Node. So for example, I can say 1 + 1, and I get back the response 2. This is a lot like that little program that we looked at before. So this JavaScript got passed into Node. Node passed it through the embedded V8 engine, as well as whatever extensions that it added to the V8 engine, and we got our response back from that code being executed. I could set a variable, for example, and get its value back. And that's it. We just wrote some JavaScript and passed it through Node. Exciting! Well, actually, pretty simple. But this, in essence, is what we're going to do going forward, sending JavaScript through Node, letting Node process our JavaScript. But instead, we're going to now let Node process a file. So I'll put my JavaScript into a file. I'll cancel out of this. I'll hit Control-C twice to quit Node. And let's look at creating a JavaScript file. Actually, this is a good time for a side note about versions of Node.js. You might be a little confused depending on which version of Node.js you've installed. You may have seen when you ran node-v something like this, a 0.12 point something. And that's fine. Actually, that version of Node, a 0.12 point something, everything we do in this course, for the most part, will work just fine. However, you may have noticed that I was running something far higher, a 4 point something. Why is that? Well, it has to do with something called io.js. What basically happened was Node was invented within a company called Joyent, but it was open sourced. And the people who worked at Joyent, who originally worked on Node, were unhappy with how often Node was being updated. You see, Node depends on V8, the JavaScript engine, as we've seen, and V8 is being updated by Google, not by Joyent or the people working on Node. So as new versions of V8 come out, you need to update the version of Node in order to be able to use the newest and latest version of the V8 engine. As V8 makes changes and as it adds features and as it adds the new features that are coming in the next version of JavaScript. So because of this, there was a split. Node.js is an open source piece of software. And so those that really wanted Node to be built and updated faster split their own version and called it IO. So they actually continued to work on this, version 1 and version 2 and version 3. And then at long last, Joyent and the people working on IO came to an agreement about how Node should be structured and updated from a clerical standpoint. And so now, in fact, right now, as this particular lecture is being recorded, a new version of Node is being released that merges Node.js and IO and merges the changes that were made in IO, all the updates, the latest version of the V8 JavaScript engine, etc. And to not cause confusion with the version numbers, the latest version of Node as of the recording of this lecture is 4.0. And this is happening, as I said, right now as this lecture is happening. So you may be using version 0.12, or if you're watching this particular course a few months from now, you may already just have version 4 point something installed. So that's fine. Again, either one of these will work for the most part for everything that we see in the course. But as future versions of Node come out, that also means you're dealing with a later version of the V8 engine, which means more JavaScript features, updated JavaScript features are available to you. All right, let's take a look at some code. I've created a folder on my computer where I'll put the JavaScript files we'll be running. You might want to do this yourself. We'll be jumping back and forth with different features and creating a fair amount of JavaScript files. And then to do my actual coding, I'll be using Visual Studio Code. You can find it at code.visualstudio.com. It's a Microsoft program, but it works on Linux, Mac, and Windows. And it's designed for coding in a variety of languages, but the first and primary is JavaScript and Node.js development. We'll see in a bit why I like to use Visual Studio Code for Node.js development, but you certainly don't have to. You can pick any text editor you like. Brackets is very nice, as well as Sublime Text, even Notepad++, and there's plenty of others. But we'll be using Visual Studio Code because it's going to help us with our Node.js development. So I'll go ahead and open Visual Studio Code. I'll go to File, Open Folder. I'll open my Node.js folder, and that's empty. Then I'm going to go ahead and right-click, New File, and I'll just call this app.js. So I have an empty JavaScript file. let's write some JavaScript. I've increased my font size quite a bit to make it easier to see for the video. I'll type var a equals 1, then var b equals 2, and var c equals a plus b. Very simple. Now I'd like to output this. If you're writing JavaScript in your browser, you may have used console.log, which logs data values to the browser console, which helps when you're trying to figure out what's going on with your programs. NodeJS was nice enough to provide the exact same concept, and they also called it console.log since we're so used to typing that, perhaps, as JavaScript developers. So I can console.log C, and this works the same as that print command that we saw in our other little program. This will output the value to the command line window. So how can I run this app.js file? I can go back to my command prompt. I'm going to go ahead and move over to the location where I put that JS file. So I'll say D:, because I put it on my D drive on my computer, then CD for change directory, documents/sandbox/node.js. That's where I put the file. If I do dir or ls if you're in Unix or Mac, I can see my app.js file is sitting there. So I can simply type node and then the name of the file that I want to run. And understand that this is pretty much how you're always going to run your Node applications. You're going to point Node at one JavaScript file. Now, in the next section, we'll see how you can actually use multiple JavaScript files behind that single JavaScript file. But you're always going to give Node an entry point, a single JavaScript file that it will run, that it will execute. So for the command line, I type node, the program, and the argument is the name of the file. If I hit enter, Node will read that JavaScript file and process it, execute it. So I hit enter, and I got my result, that console.log, and I see the 3. And that's it. I've just run my first program in Node.js. And again, that's pretty much the extent of it. The rest of this course is about what we're actually putting in those JavaScript files. Node is just running it. Now, I'd like to show you one other thing before we leave this lecture. Remember how I said Visual Studio Code helps us with Node.js development, and that's why I will be using it in this course? Well, this is a good chance to show you why. I have my app.js file open, and I'll go over to this icon, the debug area of Visual Studio Code. Now, if this is the first time you've installed it, you may have nothing there. You can just hit the play button, start, and it will actually generate a settings file for launching the application in Node.js. I'll just close this, and you'll see if I go back to files that a .settings folder has been created with that launch file and some configuration. We don't really have to worry about much there, actually. I can just go back to debug, and now I have this concept of launching app.js. So I can hit start, and what this will actually do is run app.js in Node. It will essentially run that same command. It'll run Node and give it app.js as an argument, as the file to run. So I can hit start, and it runs. See the console.log, the 3? But notice that the debugger is listening. In other words, Visual Studio Code is listening for the code that's being run. So I can go to my app.js file, and at the far left margin, I can set what's called a breakpoint. Well, actually, this is worth a big word alert. A breakpoint, a spot in our code where we tell a debugging tool to pause the execution of our code. And that's generally so we can figure out what's going on. You may have done this in the browser, or if you're coming from another programming language, you may have done this in another tool, where you simply tell the tool, which is helping us debug, that is, figure out what's wrong perhaps with our code, where to stop, to pause the code. And so it'll actually pause the execution, and we can take a look, generally in good debugging tools, at the values of variables, what's going on, what errors might be happening. And Visual Studio Code is one of those programs that lets us do that with Node.js. So I've set a breakpoint at this first line. I'll go back to my debugging. I'll hit start, so it'll run the program in Node, but now I've got the debugger attached and listening and a breakpoint, and so Visual Studio Code pauses my execution. On this left-hand side, I can see all the variables that I've created and that I have access to. We'll actually see what some of these other ones that look unfamiliar mean and where they come from later. But for now, I have a little window here where I can step over or step into. So if this was a function call, I could jump into the function or I could jump over it. And I can just step. It's called stepping through code. I can step through my code. So line 1 was run, and now A is 1. I can even put my mouse over A and get the value. B is now 2. It was undefined. Now I can see it's a 2. C is undefined until I step through the next line. C is now 3. And I notice that nothing is console.logged yet because I haven't executed that line. I'll just hit continue to let it finish. And if I go back, there's my 3, my console.log. So Visual Studio Code lets us step through code in Node.js. For that reason, we'll be using it quite a bit throughout this course. And on occasion, we'll step through code to explain what's happening. Now, you don't have to do this. You could use other tools. You could use your own text editor and simply the command line to run the program and output console.logs and other things to help you along the way. That's entirely up to you. But I'll be using Visual Studio Code, which I actually like to use in real-life development as well, because it's going to help us with understanding Node.js. All right, let's move on.